Your Excellencies, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the second day of our conference. Yesterday we could listen to highly interesting and inspiring speeches, and one of the great things was that you were not only a passive listening public, but actively participated, contributing directly to the high quality of the discussions. Looking at today's program, I expect that we have another inspiring and intellectually productive day. At about 11 o'clock, we will again have two parallel sessions, one on the politics of sustainability and the other on European social politics. Does Europe need a social model? Again, it will be in this lecture hall and in the Karl Dietrich lecture hall. Before that, we'll have an announcement. Actually, we'll have two special events. Before the first parallel sessions, we will have the announcement, actually the opening of the Montesquieu Institute. After lunch, we will have another event, the announcement of the major contributor to the European knowledge sector. We are, of course, curious who that will be. But for now, I think we could not have a better keynote speaker to warm us up for this day, this morning, than the man who I'm very pleased to introduce to you, Mr. John Vinocur. You'll know him, of course, as the sharp-witted correspondent of the Herald Tribune, who never minces his words, and certainly not when it's about the politics of his new homeland, France. But here he is now in person, and I would suggest fasten your seatbelts, because as a speaker, he is as acute, as thought-provoking as he is in his articles. Please, Mr. Vinocur, would you like to?
Thank you. It's Friday. This is Maastricht, and I'm supposed to be talking about the future of Europe, right? If nothing startling has happened overnight, I think we can say we've already seen it. Maybe not everybody's noticed. It's not so easy to notice because although we all look at the same bits and pieces of the past and the present, it's easy to disagree on what their aggregate portends. If you take Russia's current target for European Union bullying, Estonia, if you add next week's so-called EU-Russia summit in Samara on the Volga, if you look at the issue of Kosovo, if you analyze the meeting of the French elections, if you consider the period of time from France's rejection and the Netherlands' rejection of the EU Constitution till now, when France was, and the Netherlands were effectively unhooked from the EU, out of sight, out of mind, my grandmother would have said. If you think about the last 6 months of 2005 and Tony Blair's 6 months in the EU presidency, when he went from momentary status as Europe's great white hope to public desertion of the EU cause, then in my mind, disassembled, scattered, but real all the same, you can picture where Europe is going. Let me say this about myself. This American who has worked in Europe for most of his life, he has the greatest affection for the place. My 4 children, all born here, have deep ties of culture, instinct, and emotion. They have Swedish family, German family, grandmas, cousins, friends, and all of us care about Europe. Sometimes all of us, of course, despair for it, just as we do for the United States. For the next few minutes, in that context, I'm going to be making this case. A, that after years of being part of defining peace in Europe, the EU will increasingly be defined by individual nations concerned about threats to their sovereignty, security, and national independence. This already is, although nobody has quite gotten a grip on it, a tremendous challenge for the EU's unity and its desire for a common vision. Think of Russia. B, that the member standard for judging the value of the EU has moved irretrievably away from a notion of a common integrated future, call it the us in Europe, toward a multitude of individual nations' views of what is good for the EU, does rather for that country. I call that the me in Europe. And C, that there is no leadership element in Europe sufficient to give the EU the sense of a golden future. I define that leadership, above all, as an individual's leader, an individual leader's willingness to take European risks that would endanger his domestic political life. In comparison to the parish-level concerns of the EU in earlier years, those threats are now the existential matters, not of parish life and butter mountains, of military pressure and threats to energy supplies. To make my case, and hopefully to say a few things about the future that could be improved, I'd like to proceed in inverse order. That is, starting with a discussion of leadership, then taking a look at what is a kind of backwards French example, and finally moving to the issues of national interest and survival that I think will so mark the future we're examining. Leadership. Let's go back to the second half of 2005. It's a blip now, but it was a moment when leadership in the EU could have been seized for great good, not so much for a lack of vision or purpose, but out of a lack of belief, a lack of caring, and for a lack of resolve. It hasn't happened. Can you remember the time? France and the Netherlands had just voted in separate referendums to reject a draft constitution for the EU. There was an EU budget crisis revealing staggering rigidity and pettiness. And Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schröder wanted to persuade the EU to lift its embargo against the sale of arms to China. Those were the circumstances. In the midst of this, as Britain assumed the EU presidency, Tony Blair made a brilliant, although critical, speech in Strasbourg about reforming Europe. Peter Mandelson, the EU commissioner and a Blair confidant, defined the speech then as a statement that Britain was ready to seize the helm of a rudderless Europe to cathartic effect. No one could have imagined the reaction. In France, the newspaper Le Monde, which believes in the EU, although in increasingly dispassionate terms, called Blair Europe's new locus of strength, a man capable of focusing the community on its real problems. From its place further to the left, Libération actually described Blair, and I quote, as the reformer, the man on the move, the man responding to the people's fears. What an exceptional moment. From June to October that year, Blair had the momentum to drive a tank across the European stage to cheers and garlands of flowers. Except he didn't. Why? Because he couldn't talk convincingly and authoritatively as a European without stating a willingness to drop both Britain's EU rebate and the UK's resistance to membership in the euro. There was absolutely no equal trade-off in Blair's mind that would rationalize the self-inflicted pain he had to take in domestic politics in order to legitimize Britain as Europe's potential new leader. This failure in the area of leadership does not stop with the particularity of Britain's issues with European integration.